Wow, thank you very, very much, everyone. And as he said, I was actually a pastor at Zion, and anytime I was a pastor and preaching, I never felt worthy to give a message. In the same capacity here, I'm honored and humbled by the opportunity to speak before you. But I don't feel worthy to speak on this topic, but I will do the best I can to humbly just give us all a perspective on what this means in the past and what this means for us today. One thing I want to preface this all with, I'm a very gracious person, so by no means do I want anybody to leave here feeling guilty, sad, ashamed. This is an empowering opportunity for us all to see what can we do as humanitarians to make things better. Are we okay with that? Can we all agree on that? Okay, good. All right, with that being said, I will start the presentation and try to be very economical with my words here. So I titled the presentation, When It Grows, the Jim Crow Culture's Impact on Past and Current America. Because a lot of times we think of it as only something that happened in the past. It doesn't impact us today. But as we look through history, we see, sadly, it does in numerous ways. So why the title, When It Grows? I'm a pastor, so I'm always influenced by the scriptures, and this verse in particular came to my mind, James 1:15, and if you can't read it, it reads, desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. And the highlighted words, they reminded me of ethnocentrism, prejudice, and dehumanization. So ethnocentrism, if that's a word you're not familiar with, is pretty much speaking about how your ethnicity, your culture serves as the center of how you understand others. And also, an undercurrent of ethnocentrism is you tend to elevate your culture, ethnicity, above others. Prejudice, I think we understand what that means, and dehumanization, once again, treating someone as less than human. So the red words, those things came to my mind, and so this is basically an application of 115 as it goes to Jim Crow. So desires, or in this case, ethnocentric mentalities, give birth to sinful actions, or prejudice. And when sin, or prejudice, is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death, or in this case, dehumanization. So this is kind of the thing that inspired me of how to look at the origin and then the growing impact of Jim Crow. So James 1:15, that's why it's titled, When It Grows. What I want us to keep in mind in this presentation, Jim Crow is much bigger than laws. In fact, one book that I will reference later, it spoke of Jim Crow's also being an etiquette. I like to call it a culture, because culture pretty much deals with passions, ideologies, things that you do, practices. So it was deeper than just laws, much bigger than laws. It was a culture also. It's much bigger than the southern part of America. In fact, Jim Crow was felt all throughout every region in the U.S., and you'll find out later actually also had international presence as well. And it's bigger than any social or political view. So I beg you, give me the benefit of the doubt as you go through this presentation. I don't care about party lines. I'm a proud independent. But as we look through the history of it, we'll see that there are people who are liberals, conservatives, moderates, Republicans, and Democrats who all played a role in how this came to be and spread. So this, once again, is not guilt and shame any political party. God bless you for however you choose to vote. But we need to see that everyone kind of had a role in this, regardless of political or social lines. So this is not about bashing any one side. This is just trying to show how we can make things better moving forward, okay? Do I get the benefit of the doubt? Yeah. Okay, thank you, I appreciate that. All right, so what are the learning goals of this presentation? I want to talk about the origins of Jim Crow, the impact of Jim Crow on America, once again, past and current America, and then lastly, we want to talk about countering the presence of Jim Crow, because for me, I'm very much about application. Okay, it's important to know the why, but now we need to talk about the what. What can we do to make things better? Jim Crow impact on America. So the Jim Crow culture was intended to be dehumanizing from its beginning. And we see this in where it came about. So this is some of the Jim Crow origins. Around 1828, so 1828 is still during the time that slavery was in existence. Thomas Dartmouth Rice, was an entertainer from New York City. And I highlight New York City because once again we tend to think it's just the South. But here was a Yankee, who established this. So he was a performer, and performed as a character named Jim Crow, along with his song titled Jump Jim Crow. So there's a person from New York, big city. He's the one that created this character named Jim Crow, and a popular song became a very popular song that reinforced this idea and perception of Jim Crow. So Rice's show became a traveling act with major successes in places such as Louisville, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York, as well as internationally in England and Ireland. That's very important to kind of point that out, because once again, bigger than the South. We see Louisville, so that's Kentucky, that's the South. Cincinnati, Ohio, we're getting into the Midwest. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that's considered Northeast, right? That's, even though it may have kind of a Midwest flair to it at times. Philadelphia, Northeast. New York, Northeast, and once again, like I said, internationally, England and Ireland. So this wasn't just stuck in the southern part of the country. It spread. This mentality, this culture kind of spread as he gained more success. The Jim Crow character popularized blackface. So if you wonder why a lot of times in the media you hear about people who did blackface before and why it would be considered offensive, this is some of the reason why. So the Jim Crow character popularized blackface. He wasn't the first, but he made it very famous. And minstrel shows. Minstrel shows, once again, traveling acts that had various forms of what people call Jim Crow characters. Both of which, being blackface and minstrel shows, displayed caricatures of black men and women to portray them as inherently less human and not deserving of basic human rights. These various characters could do various things. They could either be seen as hypersexual, criminal, dumb, lazy, just so many very dehumanizing pictorials, but people bought into it. People spent money to see these things. And like I said, as we saw from the slide before, it was a huge success in various parts of the country and throughout the world. But once again, from its beginning, it was meant to show a group of people as being less than. The Jim Crow impact. So before I read what's there, this book here is a book I greatly recommend. If you really want to kind of have like a very small, but very, at the same time, thorough and robust understanding of the Jim Crow culture, is Understanding Jim Crow, and the subtitle is Using Racist Memorabilia to Teach Tolerance and Promote Social Justice by David Pilgrim. He actually created a Jim Crow museum at Ferris State University, I believe is in Michigan. I know it's up north, so, but a good book. And so in his book, he talks about how Jim Crow was more than a series of rigid anti-black laws. It was a way of life. Jim Crow represented the legitimization of anti-black racism. So some heavy and weighty stuff, right? And once again, it was far more than just the laws, what was considered to be legal. It was also just how people viewed a populace of people, other human beings, as a Christian, other image bearers of God. So the Jim Crow impact on America. So now I want to go through, and I can't cover everything, as I like to say that there's going to be some meat left on the bone, right? So I'm in Iowa, this steak and potato place. So think of this as a big ribeye or T-bone steak. This presentation is only going to take a nibble. There's still going to be a whole lot of meat left on the bone, but I hope that even in this nibble that we take today, you begin to see like, wow, these are just so many of the many ways in which this just kind of took hold of our country and of our society, and it still is today in some covert ways and some overt ways. And so I'm going to look at, throughout this presentation, I'm going to look at the influence on media, politics and law, law enforcement, and then also the church, because the church, we'll get to that. So that has a role in it as well. But here we're going to look at the media. So media inspired by Jim Crow culture influences people to have toxic perceptions. Heck, media, regardless of when it takes place, they have that possibility, they have the power to influence the way people think. And as we look at how the media was back then and now, we can see some of its imprint today. So here's a picture. You can't really see it very well if you're sitting very far back, but on the left is Pears Soap, a company that still exists today. And so it has two pictures. The first picture is basically someone who was seemingly Caucasian, given a bath using a pair of soap for someone who appears to be African American. Well, once that person takes a bath and cleanses him or herself, the person changes from black to white. given a perception that white is right, black is dirty and wrong. And so that was 1884. You fast forward now to 2017, this is Dove soap, and people didn't understand why people make a big deal. You can see, once again, an influence, Pear soap, Dove soap, you can see an influence where it starts off an African-American girl, but as she uses Dove soap, she transforms into white. This is 2017, 1884, we can still see that mentality, subtly or overtly, however you want to look at it, taking place today. And then also with the Pear soap, the other thing too to take into consideration, with the Jim Crow culture, you saw it on a lot of everyday items. Soaps, detergents, foods, cleaning utensils, just toys, books. Like, it was just in every little thing. It wasn't just merely, oh, some, random, bigot person who would say something. Like, no, it was everywhere. And so with that, you don't realize how much you're being indoctrinated by this. And so I think you kind of see a little glimpse of that here. All right. So to the left was a kind of a comic book, almost like an adult comic book in 1935, Spicy Adventure Stories. And what you may not be able to see here, so it's a seemingly Caucasian woman being taken away by two beastly-looking individuals who's supposed to represent, like, basically black men, right? So it was always kind of like this ape, gorilla, primate type of look. So that's 1935. So Vogue in 2008 is really, the Vogue magazine cover is the one on the far right. It has LeBron James, a great NBA player, and a model, Giselle Bundchen. Now, people looked at it first and thought, this just doesn't feel right. People don't understand why. And someone did research and found this propaganda going back to World War II, where you see destroy this mad brute. And it's a gorilla carrying a white woman with something in his right hand. People said, oh, you're thinking too much, you're over-exaggerating. But just look at the parallels. You get, so the gorilla on the propaganda, he has something in his right hand. The basketball player has something supposedly in his right hand, dribbling a basketball. Mouth wide open, kind of like a growl type of demeanor. He's in all black. They could have dressed him in something else, and obviously the gorilla is all black. Caucasian woman hangling in his left arm, or she's kind of just, seemingly to be helpless. Material of the dress very similar. Color is pretty similar. Once again, subtle ways in which reinforces the idea that blackness is less human or aggressive. There's also other pictorials of blacks that take place impacted by Jim Crow culture. If you ever heard like Uncle Tom or Coon, that is the kind of depict, once again, African Americans is kind of very submissive and they just want to be that way. And submissive is not a bad thing, but in the way in which it's portrayed of blacks is meant to be like, they enjoy being less than someone else or being under someone else. Also depict them as not very smart and just very childlike. But this I want to kind of show, once again, 1935, fast forward time, 2008, there's still this, whether it be intentional, unintentional, covert, overt, or conscious or subconscious way of seeing African Americans as, especially the men, as very beastly, primate, aggressive men, especially one who are a danger to white women, and that's something I'll get to later. So Jim Crow culture past and current America. So the one on the left is a postcard, and it's kind of depicting like the angry black woman, like caricature. And you see big mouth and kind of just like, she's even bigger than the man in this picture. Very intimidating. Once again, please ignore, the politics are just there. But basically what I want you to see is how they depict Michelle Obama. I mean, anybody see Michelle, regardless if you like the Obamas or not, Michelle Obama is a very elegant, well-fit woman, very ladylike, but the depiction here is very manly, kind of very aggressive, very mean, has a scowl, just doesn't seem pleasant. And so once again, these are just some of the things we begin to see is that there's an angry black woman image that's being reinforced throughout the ages, okay?
Make the first lady great again.
Yeah, so we can converse that about, like I said, for me this is not about political propaganda. I just want to once again show the parallels of the 1940s angry black woman image and even someone who carried herself with great elegance and dignity is still being portrayed, black woman is being portrayed as angry black person. That's all I want to show with that. Okay, so I intentionally wanted to show, everyday items, the image of the black man, the black woman, also the children and how the children were being impacted and being indoctrinated with this mentality. So here's a children's book in 1908, and the title is The Strange Tale of 10 Little Nigger Boys. And the publication of this book was in Chicago. Once again, we're not talking about the South, we're talking about the North. So this is a children's book, 1908. Fast forward time, in 2015, textbook by Reading Horizon, Discovery Little Books, this was a school textbook originating in Utah, and it was being used in Minneapolis. Minneapolis actually pulled it out of their schools because of some very racist stereotypes. And this is one in particular where you have lazy Lucy, alliteration. And basically, lazy Lucy was an African girl who was just too lazy to help out around the family. Just was pretty much good for nothing. I mean, they didn't say it that way, but if you read it, pretty much depicting, once again, someone of African descent, just no good to society. 1908, 2015, and these are what our kids of times past and times current are being indoctrinated by, being exposed to. And so we wonder how they grow up to be adults with certain perceptions that are harmful and dangerous, absolutely. So you can see how the media, in various ways, have played a role in this. Now, media inspired by Jim Crow culture reinforces propaganda that creates subconscious imprinting which impacts political and legal views. The subconscious impacting is huge because sometimes we all wrestle with ethnocentrism. This is not just a white issue. Like even myself as African American, I wrestle with ethnocentrism, and that creates subconscious ways of seeing, people who are different. And so I have to be very conscious of that and acknowledge that and find ways to say, okay, this is actually unhelpful. So let me reject this way of thinking and see this person for who they are. But a person, especially in power, when we're talking politics and legality and law, we can't separate our subconscious and what we think from like how we lead. I always find it funny when people say, well, separate your faith from your politics. Well, if your faith impacts how you think, you can't just separate that, very easily from how you govern. It's just they go together. And so we will kind of see some of this of like how this this Jim Crow culture, how it impacted our politics and law. And it's going to be heavy. These are things, sadly, we do not learn in schools, but you can see them for yourself. I'm not pulling out any propaganda, and I can show you the research where I got it from. All right, so we look at past America. President Andrew Johnson. So he was the president, after, thank you. I just drew a blank there, appreciate that. After Lincoln's assassination, and he took over. So he was president from 1865 to 1869, Democrat. These were his exact words as he wrote to the Commissioner of Public Buildings in 1866. Everyone would and must admit that the white race was superior to the black. This is the President of the United States openly propagating white supremacist views. So we have that's 1865, and I know the next slide is going to be a trigger for people, but please people, just be patient. So that was 1865, what about today? Okay? And so once again, like I said, when you look at this history, we see Democrats who got their hands dirty. Here we can see, Republicans who share certain, ideologies that are unhelpful. And King's words in an interview to Time, the New York Times in 2019, so recently, white nationalists, white supremacists, Western civilization, how did that language become offensive? How is regardless of what you think, forget the politics aside, just saying any one people group is better than another, how is that not offensive? So we just got to wrestle with that, and we got to acknowledge, this type of mentality is not going to help us grow as a society. It's not going to help us be the human beings that we need to be, especially as a country who claims to be the best country in the world. So you see in Jim Crow mentality in the past by politicians and in the current by politicians. So let's go back to the past. So after the Civil War, slavery persisted in the form of convict leasing. Convict leasing was a practice in which pretty much someone was deemed criminal and then therefore forced into pretty much free labor. And the sad thing and gripping thing about this picture, I don't know if you can tell, all these are kids. Kids about my son's age, maybe younger. My son is 11. And what happened with convict leasing is that they had what's called vagrancy laws, and they also manipulated how they took care of, and I put took care of in quotations, orphans. So vagrancy laws is that, for instance, a black person, if the person can't show papers that they were employed, and not just employed by somebody white, they'll be deemed criminal. Therefore, you're now convicted, you're now in prison, and now you have to do convict leasing. Or there are just many random, crazy, didn't even seem appropriate laws. And then for orphans, that was the other thing too. A family was poor, and then they would say, well, it seems like you don't have enough to take care of your kids. We'll take care of your kids, make sure they have a place to stay, a place to eat, pretty much remove them from the house, imprison them, and make them work the fields along with adults. So in the mind of an African American culture, slavery never stopped, even after emancipation. And so I want to kind of show some of these legal things that took place. So black codes, it took place from 1865, so the end of slavery, in quotations, end of slavery is 1865, 1866, and this here is how history.com explained black codes. Black codes were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans and ensure their availability as a cheap labor force after slavery was abolished during the Civil War. So black codes is once again, and you'll kind of see this rhythm that no matter how much we seem like, okay, African Americans got to step up and took one step forward, they took 2 or 3 steps back based off of what was allowed to be done legally. And here are the amendments, and it's always interesting because a lot of times when people like to say, well, look at what great things we did in the past, people want to point to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And on paper, they seem like they should be some very great, wonderful things for all people, especially African Americans. But just read the words and understand what took place, and you see that there were some legal loopholes that took place. So 13th Amendment was supposed to abolish slavery. But the actual wording, not my wording, you read it yourself, so it's supposed to be the end of slavery, but slavery can exist as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, and it shall exist within the United States. Wording the 13th Amendment said pretty much, yeah, slavery is done, but if the person's been duly convicted and in prison, that's in essence okay slavery. We will allow that. 14th Amendment in 1868, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And so with the 14th Amendment, that's supposed to be dealing with basic citizenship. And we see here that basically no one should be deprived of any rights, especially without due process, and they should have equal protection. But we saw even with the Constitution, did people have equal protection? No. Were people deprived by the state? Yes. So even though on paper, something should have been done, in reality it didn't. And that's the thing too, I guess, when looking at this, and I'll be quick going to the next slide. Just because something should happen doesn't mean it is happening. So just because, yes, the Constitution, written beautifully in many ways, and says things that should be taking place, doesn't mean it did take place. And then the same thing with the 15th Amendment, which is dealing with right to vote. So right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But yet we see voter suppression took place in the past. They had to pay certain taxes, had to take a literacy test, had to do like a trivia test, like name all of these people and what their name is, what their title are in order for them to vote. Being African Americans, that's what they had to endure. And so a lot of their voting rights were taken away by state, and these things were illegal to be able to do in their states. And then also previous condition of servitude, that's another debate that people have about today, like how does it apply then to people who are in jail and now released? Should they not be given their right to vote? But that's a conversation for another day. But once again, we see kind of the Jim Crow impact. There was always some legal loophole in each one that allowed oppression to continuously take place. Jim Crow laws, so that, the legal laws we look at, it takes place from 1877 and 1965. And so quickly, so the end of slavery and then before 1877 is known as the Reconstruction era. That was a time in which, honestly, you probably saw some of the most substantial growth in African American culture. You had people who were being politicians in the South. You had people, black men, who were House representative and Senate from South Carolina. Like, I didn't even think that was possible until I started reading the history. I'm like, wait a minute, there were people who elected black people back then in South Carolina. That was Reconstruction, because there was legal protection, some legal protection in place. And then, like, how do we go back? Like, how did we go from, like, it seemed like great, things are moving forward, to like, whew, it was like as if there was no progress at all. So anyway, but 1877, 1965, after the Reconstruction era until 1965, Civil Rights Movement, that's known as the Jim Crow Law era. And so this is what the book Understand Jim Crow says. After 1877, when the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, southern and border states began restricting liberties of blacks. Unfortunately for blacks, the Supreme Court helped undermine the constitutional protection of blacks with the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson, so separate but equal, in 1896 case, which legitimized Jim Crow laws and the Jim Crow way of life. The election of Rutherford B. Hayes, that is where I say, like, you look at history, everyone in essence is guilty. Conservatives, liberals, moderates, Republicans, and Democrats, because this is known as the Compromise of 1877, in which there was some controversy over if Hayes actually won the election. So there was a meeting between Republicans and Democrats, sat down and talked about it, and pretty much this was the compromise. The Democrats said, we'll let Hayes be president if you remove the legal protection and the military protection that blacks have down south. So, in essence, you need to make it allowable for us to oppress a people group, and we'll let you have the president you want. You can look at history.com, textbooks, Compromise of 1877. That is what took place, and that's, like I said, everyone's hands were dirty at that point. That played a role in allowing Jim Crow to have such a stronghold throughout our country in a legal way. All right, so we look at it from and so I made the connection with convict leasing, and you think, okay, well, that's the past, Pastor. Stuff like that just doesn't exist. We've gone so far better in our society. You can't say that something like that still exists. Here's the situation in current America. So in 2010, Khalifa Browder was accused of theft of a backpack at the age of 16 and sent to Rikers Island without ever being convicted of a crime. He spent over 3 years in Rikers Island. If you know Rikers Island, a notorious jail in New York. He never was convicted of a crime and actually was released, was still never being convicted of a crime, and they realized that he was actually innocent. But because of the trauma and stress he endured in prison, being an innocent man in jail, he mysteriously had committed suicide in 2015, actually this day, 4 years ago, on June 6th. So we still see some of this convict leasing culture, Jim Crow culture, even in our jail system. So mass incarceration, pretty much people document that as saying take place in 1970 to current. Many of the old forms of discrimination that were supposedly left behind during the Jim Crow era are suddenly legal again once you've been branded a felon. And this is by Michelle Alexander. She wrote the book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. So there are other ways, and legally, that things take place. So in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration started a practice known as redlining. This was to refuse a loan or insurance to someone because they lived in an area deemed to be a poor financial risk. These areas were typically and mostly populated by ethnic minorities, many of the black communities. So you think, wait a minute, our government actually was behind this? And you think, but that was then, this is now. There's no way in the world we're doing stuff like this now. In 2011, Bank of America had a settlement of $335 million due to discrimination against at least 200,000 qualified African American and Latino borrowers from 2004 to 2008 during the height of the housing market boom. Redlining in modern day time. Past America. And this is a very interesting thing because I think for many people, you can tell the difference in mentality. Some people would see 1964, the Civil Rights Act, to be the end of everything that was prejudice and racist, and so therefore everything after that, we've gotten better. And for a person like myself, I see that as a decent stepping stone to making things better. It wasn't like truly the end of everything that was bad. It was like at least a toe in the right direction to try to make things better. And so the signing, and so this is a picture of Lyndon B. Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is supposed to put an end to the segregation in public places and ban any employment discrimination based on ban any employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So you think, job discrimination shouldn't be taking place because of the Civil Rights Act. Here was a research done it's on Forbes and other websites have it. There were a lot of reputable organizations and research databases who were behind this work. But they did a research and noticed that since 1989, whites received on average 36 more callbacks, job callbacks, than blacks, and 24% more callbacks than Latinos. And what they were doing was looking at resumes that had equal qualifications. And the only thing you would assume the person would be either black or Latino is based off the names, and realize who got a call for, just a callback for an interview to take the job, and who didn't. Though on paper, they're equal. In some cases, the person who was black or Latino actually had better qualifications. And so the article talked about hiring biases, pretty much against blacks and Latinos that they face, hasn't improved in 25 years. This one is heavy for me. So this map here is showing where there were legal practices of eugenic sterilization. And so eugenics was a common accepted means of protecting society from the offspring and therefore equally suspect of those individuals deemed inferior or dangerous. Many times it was those considered the poor, the disabled, the mentally ill, criminals, and people of color. If you look at this map, so anything that looks like stripe color, that's a state in which on law they were able to do eugenic sterilization. And our state of Iowa was on there. This is 1935. And you would think, and this is pretty much, I'm not saying to be sensational, but this is like Hitler type of stuff, trying to control and dictate a populace of people who deserves to procreate, who deserves to live. So it's 1935, and you would think these type of things still can't be happening. That was back then, this is now, right? The California Department of Corrections sterilized nearly 150 people between 2006 and 2010 without getting required state approval and without, except for one lady, without their consent and awareness that they were being sterilized. Black and Latino make up just 40% of California's adult female population, but are 60% of the state's prison population. And they believe that pretty much of that 150%, under 150 people, women who are sterilized, pretty much you're talking about Latino and black women, who are sterilized without their consent, without their knowledge, so if they get free, they won't be able to procreate to create a new generation of people who will be a blessing to society. So I bring this up, this is, the Declaration of Independence, and it has these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As we look at the things we just discussed, so like life, we're talking about actual life, sterilization, basically that is being taken away. Liberty, we're talking about like the prison system, the jail system, that would be taken away. Pursuit of happiness, to get jobs, to just earn a living, or also life to determine where you live, that being taken away. So though this is supposed to be part of our American fabric, people can have the opportunity for life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. We've seen time in the past and time in the current that these opportunities are being taken away from people of a certain populace. Jim Crow politics and laws enable domestic terrorism and unjust law enforcement. So here's a map. So hundreds of African Americans suffered violent deaths, and many who survived, lost homes as well as properties during a 7-month period of 1919 known as Red Summer. Despite injustice by the law enforcement, courts, and insurance companies, blacks vigorously defended their well-being. There's a book called Red Summer. I highly recommend it. And it talks about this weird time that took place. And basically, this is around the end of World War I, where black veterans are coming back. And there's some hostility towards them. And the black veterans, they were like, wait, I got a chance to go overseas, feel dignified by people. So they came back with a little sense of confidence that pretty much they hadn't seen because of the oppressive state that took place in America, and there was a lot of pushback, a lot of hostility towards not just black veterans, but blacks in general. And what's always fascinating about this map when I see it, is not just the South. We saw it, so the map is indicating race riots and lynchings that took place. We see California, Arizona, Nebraska, Illinois, Connecticut, Delaware, DC area, in addition to the South. The most bloody one took place in Arkansas, if I remember correctly, but the one that tends to get the most attention is the one that took place in Chicago. But yeah, Red Summer, if you do research on that, Red Summer of 1919, you see many, many American lives were impacted. And also, once again, people say, well, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, if your life is being taken and your property is being burnt and you're not getting any protection from other people, how can you pull yourself up? Your bootstraps were taken away, or your literal life was taken away. So this is how we kind of see it still taking place today. So, Tree of Life Synagogue attack in 2018, 11 people were killed. Mother Emanuel AME Church attack in 2015, 9 lives were taken. Overland Park Jewish Center attack in 2014, 3 lives were taken. And the Oak Creek Sikh Temple attack in 2012, 6 lives were taken. All for the persons, pictured here were people who they themselves feel they identify with a white supremacist ideology. And because of that, they took the lives of African Americans, of Jewish people, of people from Middle Eastern descent. Well, Jewish people are Middle Eastern descent, but the Sikh I'm looking at, they're kind of another aspect of the East. So it's still taking place, domestic terror, and we don't use that phraseology. We always say terrorism, we think of what happened, like, rather be Muslims or whatever, coming to America. But there's domestic terrorism that's taking place here, and by a variety of people, not just Caucasians, but I'm just showing once again the Jim Crow impact and that white supremacist mentality that's still taking place even now. Once again, another domestic terrorism, and this one is heartbreaking. So a community in Tulsa, Oklahoma was known as Black Wall Street due to overwhelming economic success and wealth by the many blacks who lived in that community. However, an ethnicity-driven massacre in 1921 claimed the lives of nearly 300 people, injured over 800, and destroyed the equivalent of 35 to 40 city blocks, and literally burned down the wealth blacks worked to obtain. And that's an image of the wreckage. And that community has never been the same. Like, they've revitalized it to where it looks nice, obviously, but it has never been the same. We see modern day time. So 145 predominantly black churches suffered arson attacks between 1995 and 1996, which caused Congress to pass the Church Arson Prevention Act. And there's a map. Once again, this is not just the South. We get in Washington State, you get in California, believe Nevada, Arizona, Minnesota, Colorado, Kansas, various parts of the Northeast. The more things change, the more things stay the same. Here's an law enforcement. So this is a badge, an actual badge of a law enforcement badge taking place during slavery, 1858. You may not be able to read it, but it says Plantation Police, Georgetown County, it's in South Carolina, Runaway Slave Patrol. Time.com, so pretty much Time Magazine, their website, had an article 2017, said how the U.S. got its police force. Some of the primary police institutions there, they're referring to the South, were the slave patrols tasked with chasing down runaways and preventing slave revolts. The first formal slave patrol had been created in the Carolina colonies in 1704. Now, when people hear from African Americans that there's a fear or distrust of police, it's been generations why. And I didn't even, this was accidental when I kind of saw the connection here when I got this part from the article. So it says Carolina, the badges come from Carolina. They said it started in 1704. That badge says 1858. So just looking at this alone, 154 years African Americans in Carolina did not see law enforcement people who were there to protect and serve, but actually there to oppress. So this is generation after generation after generation after generation. So there's a context for some of the distrust within the black community. Not saying that all police should then be seen as bad people and that they can't be trusted. I'm not saying that at all. But there's a context and historical reason why. Here's modern day time. John Burge, he was a Chicago police officer, detective, and commander from 1970 to 1993. This was Chicago Times wrote about him in a 2018 article. I think this is when they were documenting when he passed away. He headed a midnight crew of officers accused of systemic abuse of more than 100 African-American suspects. The cases stretched from 1970 to 1991, and in 2016, Chicago paid $5.5 million in reparation to 57 Burge torture victims. Because he was able to close a lot of cases with a lot of, confessions, but they found out that they were intimidated, they were beaten, it was not done legally. But once again, if you wonder why would a people group have an issue with law enforcement or concerned that they're not there to protect and serve, sadly, we see too many incidents of this happening. Doesn't mean that police should be demonized. Heck, I wanted to be a police officer. But you can understand why. It's not just a media sensational thing. There's a historical reason for it. J. Edgar Hoover, FBI director from 1924 to 1972. These are some of his inspired words of the FBI, Martin Luther King Jr., 1963. That date is important because these words come after Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech. So you would think, well, you guys, I'm assuming many or most of you pretty much were there, think like, okay, after hearing that beautiful speech, everybody loves Martin Luther King, like this is where we want to go, and if nobody's behind it, they must be just like, ignorant, unintelligent, just crazy person in the rural South. But this is what J. Edgar Hoover set the tone for the FBI, and these are the words following the I Have a Dream speech about Martin Luther King Jr. Say he's the most dangerous and effective Negro leader in the country. And he headed what's called COINTELPRO, COINTELPRO, and it is documented. You can look up FBI documentation that there was a strategic attack against black civil rights leader in a black community by the FBI. And this was headed under J. Edgar Hoover. And I can relate, sadly, to this idea that a person who wants to talk about social injustice and want to make things better, all of a sudden seem as dangerous. When I was a pastor in Washington State, you think, Washington, liberal, welcoming, you're not going to have any problems. As Bill was talking about with the community there, they had the landmarks Jim Crow. When I decided to talk about those things, as well as other forms of injustices, I got a plethora of pushback. And all of a sudden seemed to be the problem. Wait, I am talking for reconciliation and that's a problem?
He's the problem.
Yeah, I became the problem. In the same way MLK was a problem for talking about reconciliation, I suffered the same backlash. Thankfully, not my life, but I got a lot of critique and harsh things happening, pretty much alienated within the community. So that was the past. This is the current. We look at the FBI. So this is FBI agent Terry Aubrey. Minnesota Public Radio wrote this about him. So Aubrey was fired from the FBI in 2017 due to his 2016 sharing of internal documents. Against the law, justly so, he should be fired. But he did so because he was disturbed by investigative practices that appeared to target and intimidate Minnesota's Somali American community. So he was noticing as an FBI agent that the branch in Minnesota was unjustly targeting Somali, that's a country in Africa, Somali American communities. And he's like, this is not right, this should not be happening. So once again, sadly, we see that even within our illustrious FBI, there is a systemic look at a people group in certain cases. Not all cases, just in certain cases. Here's a case here in Waxahachie, if I remember I pronounced that correctly, a small town in Texas, close to Dallas and Fort Worth. Here's an account of a gentleman named Eli Green. He was a black World War I veteran. He was taken out of his car, dragged for a block, and heavily beaten while in his uniform by a white sheriff deputy and 3 white police officers while 50 other men watched. So that was post-World War I. Does that sound anywhat familiar to you guys now about something that happened in our history that could be somewhat similar?
Yeah.
Rodney King, pulled out of his car, beaten. Many police officers watched while this person was unjustly beaten, and you can see some of the injuries he sustained. Blood, his whole eyes fully red from blood vessels, broken jaw, other things. So it's 1991, and then when people wonder why the riots took place in Watts in LA in 1992, because all the police officers who were involved in his brutal beating, they were all acquitted. And so this is once again a case in which, African Americans, we want to trust the government. We want to trust the judicial system. We want to trust the police. But when we see things like this, it's like, we're struggling. We're just struggling. So once again, past in America, so white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, who often had the cooperation of the courts and the police, used violence and terror to strip African Americans of their rights and dignity. This is an actual picture from Portland, Oregon, in which it says, "Chief Kluxers tell law enforcement officers just what Mystic organization proposes to do in city of Portland." And you think that's the past, we're not going to do anything like this again. On October 17, 2006, the FBI Counterterrorism Division released their assessment titled "White Supremacist Infiltration of Law Enforcement." They themselves were starting to see an uptick of people who are openly or covertly white supremacists gaining positions within law enforcement. FBI, not me, it's the FBI. So if a majority, and so we looked at all this, and so now I'm going to get closer to the end and open up for Q&A. So we looked at the media, we looked at politics and law, we looked at law enforcement. But this is for me as a pastor, my mentality is that if a majority of America was supposedly made of Christians during the Jim Crow era, then the church, Big C Church, all Christian community in America shouldn't have allowed the Jim Crow culture to happen and or grow. And so here you're going to see some moments, and then I will open up for Q&A. So Jim Crow culture mentality in the past in America in the church. William Joseph Simmons, a very open person who was supportive of the Klan and considered to be a very powerful preacher. I put that in quotations. He thought that pretty much it was godly, it was Christ-like to engage in this Jim Crow culture with the Ku Klux Klan. And this is just my pushback when I look at a person like him. You look at the Bible, pretty much Jesus says, "Not everyone who calls out to me, Lord, went to the kingdom of heaven." So basically kind of point out those who truly follow Christ, only those who actually do the will of my Father. That is not the will of the Father, but yet many people will and able not to take place within the church. So that's the past. What about now? This is I don't know which congregation he's a pastor of, but he's from the state of Iowa. Jamie Johnson actually used to have a position with Homeland Security and their faith connection. But these are his words recently. Not recent like, last week, but within modern time. America's black community that has turned America's major cities into slums because of laziness, drug use, and sexual promiscuity. As a Christian, as a pastor, we can never attribute the mass of depravity to just one people group. Why? Because the Bible tells for everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard. But this is a person who sees blacks to be the problem of America. And once again, you see that very much Jim Crow, laziness, drug use, sexual promiscuity, things that you would hear very frequently in the Jim Crow era. Look back at the past. Martin Luther King, we like to say, oh, everyone loved Martin Luther King. This man was actually in jail. He was put in jail because of what he did. So not everybody liked what he did. But we like to think of that everybody loved what he did. No, he was vilified, and we saw earlier from J. Edgar Hoover and FBI. But here is one of the things he wrote when he was in the Birmingham jail. "I felt that white ministers would be some of our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent." I can relate to that again. Once again, like the biggest proponents I have even now about trying to do something like this are my brothers and sisters in Christ of the Caucasian background. Still love them, still going to offer grace, but it's troubling that even that still exists today. And we look here when Jesus said, "What sorrow awaits you Pharisees, for you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb and gardens, but you ignore justice and the love of God. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the more important things." Christ himself was also concerned about justice. It was not just a, issue that the church should not be worried about. But we see this mentality still taking place, that the church should be worried about justice, respect this man as a theologian to some degree, but we're going to disagree, he and I, on this. So this is John MacArthur, very popular guy. He wrote on his blog, gracetoyou.org, "Even more troubling are statements that have been made by certain evangelical thought leaders who claim that anyone who doesn't advocate for social justice is preaching a truncated gospel." And as it's saying, social justice, should not be seen as something that's important to the church and to proclaim the gospel. That's a separate thing. But you look to Christ, when he is quoting Isaiah in a synagogue, Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news, the gospel, to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, and that the blind will see, and that the oppressed will be set free. Jesus see, gospel over here, social justice over here. Part of bringing good news is, yes, this vertical relationship, but it's also this horizontal correction, too, that takes place among humanity. So justice was important to Christ. Justice should be important to the church as well. And then my last example is we see here, past America, this Jim Crow mentality. A person who was considered man of the year wrote the word, or said the words, "The good Lord set up the customs and practice of segregation." And then Jesus says, "For your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." That mentality is not a reflection of what Christ thinks of the Christian church. But you think that's then, 1957, what about now? Sadly, a black pastor in the same state, 2018, had put this sign up, just saying, white folks refuse to be our neighbors. So they still feel in that situation, in the same state right now. But we must remember what Christ's words were, that the second commandment is equally important to the first: love your neighbor as yourself. So lastly, what are some practical things we can do? These are things I want us all to take away, for you and myself, is we need to have humility in listening to the frustration and suffering of other ethnicities. We must educate ourselves as well as others on the contributions and hardships of non-white ethnicities in America, because our textbooks tell us plenty about white America. I don't think we know enough about other people groups. But we want to advocate for a change in our American education system, how we teach American history regarding non-white ethnicities. But lastly, this is kind of getting to the heart issue. Remember, desiring compassion for yourself and extend compassion to each ethnic people group. So hopefully that was beneficial to you. Hopefully you learned something from it.